So downhill MIG welding is probably the easiest and fastest way to weld a vertical joint. But should you do it, and is it a strong weld? So the answer to this is sometimes. So in this video, we'll be going over exactly when you can weld downhill and when you probably shouldn't. But first, let's go over how to downhill MIG weld the right way. So this goes for any time you're MIG welding, but especially with downhill since it doesn't penetrate that much to begin with. If you don't clean the mill scale, it will make it even harder for the weld to penetrate the material. So making sure you're cleaning off the mill scale will really help with getting better penetration. So when you're welding a vertical joint like this, gravity is constantly pulling down at your weld puddle. So when you're welding uphill, it's way harder because you are fighting gravity the whole way up the joint. But with welding downhill though, it's way easier because you are working with gravity and the puddle literally falls right into place. But the biggest key here when welding downhill is you want to run hot and fast. The biggest problem with downhill welding is that it's usually not a very strong weld and it usually lacks penetration. So running hot with your settings helps you get more penetration, but since you're running hotter, the puddle is more liquidy and watery, so you gotta travel fast to stay in front of the puddle when gravity is pulling it down. So when you're traveling down the joint, you always want the arc to stay on the leading edge of the puddle so the puddle doesn't run down in front of the arc, and that's what causes lack of penetration. So for finding the right settings going downhill, as with any other position or technique, always start hot and dial it back from there. If the puddle is just out of control and it falls down super easy, and in extreme scenarios like you can see here, the puddle is pouring out of this joint and it left a little molten worm just laying on top of the material. So if your puddle is out of control, then you know you're too hot. But on the other hand, if you see your edges of your weld not soaking into the material and it's just laying on top of it, it's probably not penetrating enough and you're too cold. The weld might look good, but as you can see here, the edges just aren't really fused. And in reality, there's just no penetration behind this weld. So there's a fine line and a sweet spot where you're running hot enough to soak into the material, but cool enough where you can still control the puddle. So this is how I run my downhill MIG welds. I usually have a dragging angle with my gun, and I don't really manipulate the puddle much at all, and I just drag this thing all the way down the joint. As I'm traveling along here, I'm watching the edges right here fuse into the material, and then I know it's penetrating good. And I'm also watching the puddle size, and that is determining my travel speed. If you have trouble with your bead not looking consistent all the way down, it usually comes down to your travel speed. So if there's parts of your bead where it gets wider, that's where you may have traveled a bit slower. And then on the other hand, where the bead gets narrower, that's where your travel speed increased a bit, and you're almost outrunning the puddle. So make sure you are watching the puddle the whole time and moving along just fast enough to keep it the same size all the way down. And I know you've heard me say this before, and I'll keep saying it, and I'll keep preaching this. Watching the puddle is the biggest key to welding, and it tells you everything. Now, in what scenarios can you use downhill MIG welding? I always recommend not welding anything thicker than 1/8 inch material with downhill, because once you go thicker than that, it's going to be hard to get that good penetration. But the exception to this would be vertical outside corner joints. This would be another scenario where I use downhill. Since you're basically welding the edges of two plates together, you don't really need a ton of penetration and a ton of heat. So going downhill makes welding it a lot easier, faster, and gives you way better results. Now with vertical outside corner joints, I would run it downhill up to about 1/4 to 5/16 thick material. Once you get thicker than that, like 3/8 and up, I would switch to uphill in order to get some better penetration. So if you struggle at all with uphill MIG welding and it's kicking your butt, I made a video right here going over some common mistakes beginners make and go into detail exactly how to do it and get slick results.